over the time that I've been here, I probably have quoted more often from Catholic writers and Catholic theologians. So this is to the benefit of Ron and Bob Wallace, that I'm going to speak a little bit about two Protestant theologians, Paul Tillich and H. Ronald Niebuhr. Neither of whom I read when I was in the seminary. It was afterwards that I got to read them. And the reason why I want to present this to you at the beginning, it's a little esoteric, so please don't go to sleep, all right? There's a point in this. I'll get to it. But I just want to present it because I think this is an important context to offer what these scriptures have to say to us today. And the reason why I say it's an important context, because at least how I feel as a pastor and a preacher and a Christian, as a man, that it's just like a big struggle these days. It's a big struggle to make sense out of not only the scriptures, but my own spirituality and where we're at in the world and what's going on in the world. It's like I promise myself I'm not going to look at Facebook or watch the news, and I get sucked into it every time and end up with blood pressure, red in the face, veins popping out of my head. So I don't know, not that anybody else is going through the same thing, right? But I want to offer some thoughts before looking at these scriptures and then seeing what the challenge that we have today. Many years ago, I became familiar with the book by Niebuhr, and it was called Christ in Culture. I just want to speak to this. There's lots of challenges that this book has had over the years. He originally gave lectures on it in 1949, and then put the book together in 1951. To many over the years, especially in the last decade, 20 or 30 years, it doesn't quite ring true for a lot of people anymore as to what he said. But he pointed to this. He said there are 5 kinds of ways to consider how Christ or how Jesus is in the midst of us, if you will, or maybe not in the midst of us. And he says that one way to consider this is that Christ stands against culture, that somehow Christians have to be opposed to the dominant culture to such an extent that they might willingly withdraw from culture. Because culture, the world, is so contaminated and so awful that we can't do anything about it, so we withdraw from it. And you might consider people like the Amish, right? I remember driving in Indiana and almost having a terrible accident because of coming up over a rise, and there was a horse and buggy right in front of me, and I went, what the heck is that? Who drives that in the world anymore? And the Amish have chosen, right, to disconnect from culture because they just believe there's nothing they can do about it, and so the only thing they can do is just live their lives separately. I think of the Shakers also as another movement that withdraw from culture to try to just live their holy lives waiting for the end to come. So that's one of the categories that he talks about. Another is that Christ is in the midst of culture, that Christ is already present within culture, and that we can see signs and things that are evident of Christ being present in culture. Various acts of compassion. I think of, in the Catholic realm, the work of St. Vincent de Paul, maybe what Chandler Christian Center does. There's ways that we bring Christ into the midst of culture, and certainly in our UCC tradition, this is kind of where we stand, that Christ is here and that we are to work for agents of the kingdom and to work to bring as best we can to the world and to people around us. Another is that Christ is kind of above a culture, that there's a synthesis that we can have in regards to the world and Christ and its ways, but the world has its part, but grace or God or Christ is kind of there outside, and sometimes it makes its way in, but we live in the world in this way, always aware that grace transforms us. It's like the hymn, Amazing Grace, right? We live in the world, but it's only this external intervention of God's grace that is going to make any difference for us. Another one is that Christ and culture are in a paradox. And it's just like, how does this work? They're to be in the world, but not a part of the world. We love people for themselves or some task for itself, yet paradoxically, we also love them for Christ and in order to love Christ better. In other words, it's almost to say that as people do it, that we can love people who maybe are in an opposite political party than we are, or hold different points of view. That it's a paradox, isn't it? How can you be a lover and maybe not be so much of a lover in terms of another's? But we're called, it's kind of a paradox of the ambiguity of it. And the last one that, I guess, as he writes the book, this is where he's directed to. And when I first got this, it was one that appealed to me, but then as I read other reviews of it, it didn't seem like it was too much. And this is Christ the Transformer of Culture. Christ comes to transform and change culture, to convert us to a new way of being in the world. And that's what I think about. Maybe not in the way that Niebuhr thought about it, but if the invitation, remember how the beginning of Jesus' public ministry was? The reign of God is at hand. Reform your lives, change your lives, transform your lives, and believe more fully in the vision that God has for the world. So that's the idea, that we're struggling, I think, to find the place where Christ is going to be in our midst. It's either we can't do it, so we separate ourselves, or that we try to make the world look like Christ according to maybe one narrow view of understanding it. And so in our society today, that there's liberal, moderate to liberal to progressive Christians on one side, and there's very fundamentalist and conservative Christians on the other, both claiming to have the vision of Christ, and obviously they don't, because they don't seem to mix. Maybe that's the paradox of it all. How can we both be reading the same scriptures and listening to the same vision, and yet come to very different conclusions about it? And maybe that's my struggle. That I often rant and rail at the TV when speakers on behalf of Christianity get up and speak a vision that is contrary to what I believe. How can that person represent Christianity when maybe more progressive views of Christianity don't get? But we know how the news media works all of that, right? So here's the challenge. We hear this in Leviticus. The scholars say that Leviticus comes after the Israelites have returned back to Israel. And there was lots of hard feelings, obviously, not only towards God, but hard feelings against the people who had held them captive for so long, the Babylonians and the Assyrians. And so they came back with a sense, not only should we, in that kind of separate from the culture, be holy. And in that time period, they thought that holiness was equivalent to being pure. And so the priest enacted all kinds of religious laws that were to separate the Israelites from this terrible world around them, because it was going to be only the Israelites that were going to ultimately get saved. Now the prophets are going to say something contrary or different from that. But that's what the priest and what the book of Leviticus. But if you listen to it, and the reason why I say this, because I don't hear a lot of Christians saying this. It's like, don't harvest all your crops, keep some for the poor. There's no ambiguity in that statement, is there? It's pretty clear what the Israelites are to do. Don't do this because this. It's pretty clear that as Leviticus describes various scenarios that the average person in Israel would have, that they couldn't think that they didn't need to care for the poor or the aliens. And here it's not people from outer space. It was maybe the Babylonians in their midst. It might have been people who, when Cyrus the Great conquered the Babylonian Empire, that there were lots of people in exile that were not Israelites. And so when Cyrus says everybody's free, many of those people thought that by going with the Israelites to Israel, that they would have promise that they would have prosperity. And so they wanted what the Israelites wanted. And so a lot of the people that had come back with the Israelites were not Israelites at all. In fact, some of them were not even believers. And so the priest wanted to get rid of all of them. And what it says, you can't get rid of them. You can't send them back home because they don't have any home. Their homes have been destroyed. You can't send them back. Let them live in your midst and care for them as your own. Let them live in your midst and care for them as your own, because they have nothing else. In a sense, Israel, you will be a better example of who I am to these aliens, immigrants, refugees. You will be a better example of who I am to them if you welcome them, make them a part of your community, treat them with the same dignity you expect to be treated with. You will be a better example to the world of who I am than if you send them away, deport them, get rid of them, treat them like dirt. Because the Babylonians and the Persians are going to say, ha ha ha, look at you. You make a claim to God being a God of compassion and mercy, and look how you treat the aliens and strangers in your midst. That Israel would be a laughing stock. Doesn't surprise anybody, right? That if you don't match the action with what you believe, you become a laughing stock and look very foolish. So the book of Leviticus gives some pretty clear instructions on how to be community and how to treat the people at the edges and the margins with dignity and respect. Now that was just for Israel. There was no expectation that Babylon or Persia or ultimately Greece, Greeks, or the Romans were ever going to follow that. It wasn't important. What was important was that within the people, within the community of faith, this is how we were to be. So telescope forward a few more years into the Roman Empire and being Jewish under the Roman Empire in the first century before the Common Era in the first century. Being Jewish in that time led you to perhaps do as Niebuhr does, is to say, you know, we just cannot possibly live in this corrupt empire of Rome, because the expectation is that we will not only buy into their gods and goddesses, but follow their moral and ethical debacle. And so they separated themselves from the community of Israel. The people that today we know about, the Essenes, go out into the desert and totally separate, waiting for the great battle between good and evil to take place. And that's the only way that they understood that they could accomplish their faith, was by going off into the desert, isolating themselves from even the rest of the people of Israel. And then there were people within the Jewish community who said, you know, if you can't beat them, join them. And so they totally accommodated themselves to the empire. Now, they still maybe went to the synagogue on Sabbath. Maybe not. Maybe they said, you know, we can worship God anywhere, so let's just go out to the beach and enjoy the beach. And one of my trips to Israel, I was out on the beach on Saturday and just was totally confounded as to why the beach was packed to the gills with people. And probably, like, you had to drive to get to the beach, right? Well, if you were an observant Jew, you probably would not have been on the beach on Saturday. You'd be at home with your family. So I suspected that all those people out of the beach were not very observant of their Jewish faith. And that's kind of how some Jews in the first century were. Some just kept believing that it's like Matthew's gospel that we've been reading. Some believed that if we were just strong enough in the example of our lives, Rome would leave us alone, and we could deal with the empire on its own terms, but just as long as Rome left us alone. And that seemed to be a part of the way it was, that when Rome ever conquered a given region that maybe had its own religion and its own gods and goddesses, that Rome just basically let them continue honoring their gods and goddesses. There was no expectation placed upon the Jews of the first century that they ever had to honor the emperor's God. They still had to go to the temple and honor the emperor on his birthday. But they didn't have to ever do that. So there was some degree of leniency that the Romans gave to the Jews. But that's about as far as it went. So it, on the outside, looks like at least the Jews were free to worship as they wanted. Yes, but not really free. I wonder if building a synagogue in some city in the Roman Empire was so easy to do. Especially when the neighbors might complain and get all up in arms, like, how dare this religious cult of Judaism come into our neighborhood? And so what happened was that while there was freedom for the Jews in the Roman Empire, culturally, socially, economically, politically, they were at the bottom of the social ranking. So even though they had some degree of independence, they were still greatly oppressed. And I mean that seriously, greatly oppressed. That their freedom of movement was probably curtailed, that their participation in the economics of the empire were curtailed, so they didn't have lots of freedom. And so as the people understood this, and as Matthew's gospel comes to this point, and let me remind you, we're in the so-called Sermon on the Mount. And I suggested the very first week that we did this, that when Jesus goes up on the mountain, the idea is that for this community of Jewish Christians that Matthew is writing to, that it always had to be that Jesus stood in the center as an example for how they were to act and behave in the world around them. So the model was Jesus. How does Jesus respond? What is, and not to make it trivial, but, what would Jesus do in this kind of situation? And that's pretty close to what it would be. So the invitation that Matthew is extending is always keep focused on what you know is your moral core and center, Jesus. But what happens when you come into conflict with the Romans around you? How are you going to respond? And here's the point. And this is where I'll bring in Tillich and his book, which was, I got the date on when I bought this, 1976. How I've kept a hold of this, I don't know. But his book is The Courage to Be. Now, there's lots of philosophical parts of it that I didn't understand. But let me read this. This is what he has to say. Courage is the self-affirmation of being, in spite of the fact of non-being. It is the act of the individual self in taking the anxiety of non-believing upon itself by affirming itself either as part of an embracing whole or in its individual selfhood. Now there you go. That's the philosopher and the theologian, right? In other words, courage is that in the face of not existing, in the face of not keeping a hold of your dignity, in the face of possible loss of even your life, courage comes when you respond to that reality of the potential of losing your dignity, your integrity, and your life itself. Courage comes in that moment when you can stand in resistance to the violence that might be done to you, either the psychological violence or the physical violence, or even the economic or political or social violence, that you can stand in resistance to the violence that is being done to you with courage so that you don't lose who you are. Because if you give in, you lose yourself. Just being honest and personal, at the point at which I was making my decision to leave the Roman Catholic Church, that's exactly what the issue was. If my dignity and my integrity matters to me and comes from God, then whatever decision I make cannot be made with fear or anxiety that somehow or another, if I make that decision, I'm going to lose everything. And yes, that is true, there was a potential of losing everything. But I knew that what I would lose even more would be my dignity and my integrity. And integrity for me was that I matched words and actions. For example, that if I believe that women should be called to ministry, and I have to get up in the pulpit and say, I don't think women should be called to ministry, then it destroys my dignity and my integrity. If I believe that gay and lesbian people should be included and not be considered disordered, but have full equal dignity, and I have to get up and preach against that, then you see I destroy myself. And I can't say that I felt courage at the time, but I knew that if I didn't do this, stand on my principles and my values, my dignity and my integrity would be destroyed. So that's what Tillich is saying in terms of courage. So here's how it works. Let's see. Come up. Can you come up just a second? Just come up just a second. So now imagine in the first, no, just look at me. Okay, so do what I'm telling you to do, okay? So whatever I tell you to do, that's what you're going to do, all right? Don't question it. Don't think anything about it. Just do what I'm telling you to do. Now, think in the first century. What's the position of women in the first century? So that Teresa, if Teresa is a Jewish Christian in Matthew's community, that she's now got a vision of herself based upon what she's coming to believe about Jesus. That Jesus respects the dignity, even women, in an equal way to men. So that she's now becoming aware in her own life and in her own self that she has equality to men, that she has dignity not dependent upon men, but dignity upon her own self-agency. And I come along and just tell you, do what I tell you to do. Don't question it. Obey and follow. Now, if I'm a first century Roman, that's how I'm going to treat Teresa. So that I don't even have a respect for her humanity in a sense, but rather believe that she is somebody that I can simply walk over and treat in a bad way. So the scripture says, what? If someone slaps you on the one cheek, all right? So I judge that you stood there with such perseverance and such stamina that that's an affront to my masculine sense of power and authority and dominance over women and the world. So I'm going to treat you as I think you should be treated. You've affronted me, so I'm going to slap you, to show you and to teach you, and to make sure that, Teresa, you understand your place. All right? So I slap her. I remember how the scripture went. Now you see, she hasn't, what's happened is that in first century culture, that the only way that I can now, she turned her face to me, and that's got me even more ticked off. And so I want to slap her even harder. But I know that as your cheek is turned, I'm not going to be able to do it this way. And if I even think of using this hand, that has even made it worse for me, not for Teresa. This is the dirty hand in first century. All you left-handers who grew up being told you couldn't use your left hand know what I'm talking about, and who were forced to use your right hand. So I no, I can't do that. So I try to do this. That's even more of an affront to my position and my standing in the community. I'm already making this too long. You can see each one of these. Thank you, Teresa. first century, it took a hell of a lot of courage to stand in resistance to the Empire of Rome. And the resistance comes in the form of I cannot let myself be so demeaned and degraded and debased that I lose my own sense of dignity and worth. Now, you need to know that that's not just for me as an individual, that in resisting me, she disrupts my whole sense of masculinity, my whole sense of power and domination and authority. She catches me off guard to the point where I don't know how to respond anymore. And since I don't know how to respond, I just as soon turn and walk away, and there it is. That the resistance and the disruption of all of that political and social and economic power that the Romans, who thought they were gods themselves, comes in the face of a Jewish Christian woman who says, I'm not going to let them do that to me. But notice, she didn't haul off and smack me either, did she? Maybe he wanted to do that. She didn't do that. And there is the second point of it. That disrupting the system of power politics and economic authority and domination, resisting it and disrupting it cannot come with another act of violence in return. It cannot do that. Because then we are no better than the one who has perpetrated the violence against us. So, Gandhi says, an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. We did this when we went to war in Afghanistan and Iraq. You got us, so we're going to get you back with as much violence. A job has been taken from me, so I'm going to make sure that no one has a chance to take my job because their skin is brown and they can't talk English. Women, you have no right to your bodies. We're going to make the decision for you. The invitation of Matthew is to disrupt and resist the powers that enslave and oppress and diminish our dignity. If that's true, then if Jesus stands in the center, then we can never, ever make choices and decisions to diminish or degrade the dignity of other people. That's what the last part of that scripture is. Or can't speak your language. If you hate them, then Jesus doesn't stand at the center of your life. Nor does the vision of the reign of God that is meant to transform and change the world. Simple as that. That's what the scripture says. And I believe it so strongly that the invitation has to be for us to transform our hearts and to change the way that we respond to the various struggles and crises and challenges of the world around us. We cannot act and behave in a way that's contrary to the gospel. We have to live the gospel. Loving neighbor, loving enemies, doing good to those who oppose us, but doing it in such a way that we resist, and we disrupt the definers of a culture built on hate and prejudice and fear.